The global oil price decline has eaten heavily into the revenues of the world's top oil exporters. Despite efforts to cut spending and find alternative revenues, for the oil exporters of the Middle East, North Africa, Caucasus, and Central Asia, this reduction in oil revenues has created large fiscal deficits, the term used to describe the gap between overall revenues and expenditures. For oil exporters in the Gulf, the Caucasus, and Central Asia and Algeria, the combined deficit in 2015 was about $150 billion, 6 times what it was just 2 years ago, before oil prices started falling. At that time, these countries used their savings to cover about 80% of their fiscal deficits. With the overall fiscal deficit projected to be another $140 billion this year, countries need to find alternative sources of financing in order to preserve their savings for the future.
The challenge for these countries is to decide how much of their deficits should be financed through borrowing and how much should be financed by drawing down their assets. And these are tough choices. Is the rate at which they can borrow more or less than the rate of return on their accumulated savings? What was the original plan for those savings? And if they're used up now, will that create new problems down the line?
Borrowing is likely to be the backbone of this year's financing. The IMF expects the oil exporters to use new borrowings to cover about 70% of this year's deficit, or about $100 billion. Countries now have to make a choice between either borrowing domestically or internationally. Since the drop in oil revenues has resulted in less money flowing through the domestic banking systems, the best way forward seems to be borrowing internationally.
These oil exporters have been particularly active in the international markets this year, highlighted by Qatar's $9 billion jumbo deal in May, Oman's return to the Eurobond market after a 19-year absence.
However, international markets can be unpredictable, so countries need to diversify their options by increasing the capacity of their domestic markets. Doing this would involve bringing in new investors or growing the assets of the domestic banking system, including through greater financial inclusion.
All of this would enable governments to borrow more domestically without choking off the supply of new credit to the private sector.
Oil prices are predicted to remain in the range of $55 a barrel by the end of the decade, substantially lower than the price needed to balance budgets. How fiscal deficits are financed is likely to be an issue for the next few years and possibly even longer. Even though deficits are expected to narrow, the IMF projects the cumulative fiscal deficits for the oil exporting countries of the GCC, CCA, and Algeria to be about $340 billion between 2017 and 2021, or on average of almost $70 billion per year during that period.
How countries choose to finance their deficits will impact not just this generation, but future generations as well. That means investing in the capacity to make good choices, so developing strong institutions and governance frameworks, will be critical for these economies. As always, the IMF will be ready to provide support and advice, including through technical assistance, training, and, if needed, financial support.